the same across multiple tokens, but then after that it kind of diverges and everything else changes. And if you remember, the reason behind that is if you change the one block of one bit or byte of plain text, that affects all the ciphertext after it. So typically, you'll see that sort of pattern where there may be some similarities at the front end, but then it kind of you don't see any of it after that for like the rest of the token. If you see something like that, that's not a definite indication that it's CBC, but it's something to kind of keep in your head as you're trying to figure out, is this thing exploitable or not? Now here are the, as opposed to the kind of the passive things that we were talking about before, these are more of the active things that you can do with regard to the token to try and understand what's going on. So does the length of the encrypted data change based on the length of some value that you can supply? So the very common example in a web application, let's say there's just some piece of data in say, your profile information that you control that is somehow, for whatever reason, stored in a cookie. So let's take your email address, for example. If I change my email address in my profile to something that's 1 byte longer than it currently is, does my cookie increase by 1 byte? If I increase it again by 1 byte, does it increase? Does that increase mirror itself in the cookie? Or can I just keep increasing it byte by byte and the cookie stays the same, but then at a certain point the cookie jumps 8 bytes in size? Well, that's going to be a real good indication of not only that there's a block cipher in use, but also what the block size is, because it's going to jump by a certain amount. How does the encrypted data change in response to user supplied data? What different fields that I have control over can I use to affect the token? So is it just the email address, or are there other things that are being stored in there? It's kind of a binary way to figure out, even though you don't know how it's being stored, what is actually being stored in there. And then also, if I change one character in a particular piece of input that I know has an effect, what do I see? What's the type of change that I see in the cookie? So if I change one character, is it a 1 character change, or do we see an 8 character change, or does the whole thing change? And that'll give you a better idea of what's underlying. Okay, so that was the sort of the intro, and the rest of this is case studies, and hopefully it'll tie together some of those concepts. Sorry? Can the encryption engine be used in Oracle? Is the application using the same encryption mechanism in multiple places? So if I have control over one, can I change something? Can I use it to figure out what's the encrypted form of blah, and then use that somewhere else in the application where it's decrypting using the same mechanism? Okay, so this is a standard web application that we're looking at. This is a fetch of the My Account page, and the only important thing to look at here is just the fact that we're passing over 2 cookies, EM cookie and an EE cookie. And just, I guess I should also make the point that everything in the case studies is from real-world pen tests, but it's been heavily sanitized to change the names of cookies and make sure that all, any information leading to a particular website has been removed. So what we notice as we're going through the application, just using a standard web proxy tool to look at the requests that are being issued back and forth, we see that the EE cookie is reissued on each request. So every time I request a new JSP page, I get a new EE cookie. The old ones still remain valid for a certain period of time. So at any given time, I may have hundreds of EE cookies that will be accepted by the application. I don't know, just a side note. So I was supposed to say, well, so what does that look like in terms of encoding? If you look at the character set, you probably recognize that it's using upper and lowercase alpha, 0 to 9, and then a couple other characters plus slash and equals, and that's kind of your standard base 64 character set. So the first kind of thing that we will do is just base 64 decode that, and see if we can immediately read stuff in there, which is, it's nice, the nice slam dunk, but unfortunately we can't in this case. So we decode it with base64, and now we get some equally weird looking garbage. So if we go back now to those passive techniques that I talked about, we'll look at the length of this and see, okay, does it correspond to any known block size? Is this a multiple of 8 or 16? If you break it down, you'll see that it's in chunks of 8, 8 bytes at a time. So okay, maybe this is a block cipher. And we captured way more than 8 of these. I mean, we probably captured about a couple hundred of these at least, just to gather enough data. But 8 fit on the screen. So looking for those sort of patterns in the blocks, one of the things that we mentioned before was looking for repetition. So you usually end up having to stare at these things for a little while, but or put it through some other script that's kind of keeping track of which blocks appear and how many times they appear, and you can do some heuristic calculations like that. But when you do that, you notice that there is some repetition. It's not so important that the block in red appears at that same position in 6 different blocks. What's important is that it shows up in position 4 and position 6 in that first block. And similarly with the blue one, you see a repetition at different positions in the token. So a real cryptographer could probably tell me what the chances are of that happening in a CBC mode or something like that, but I'm going to say it's really low. So I'm thinking at this point that this might be an ECB mode cipher. So now going to the active techniques, determining what is in that thing. We noticed in looking at the broken down blocks on the previous screen that the only variable blocks are really the last 2. Actually, I should just go back a second. You see that the first 5 bytes, the first 5 blocks pretty much stay the same across multiple tokens, and then the last ones kind of switch around a bit. And we talked about how at any given time a bunch of cookies were valid, and eventually they'd time out. So maybe that last 2 blocks are some sort of timeout, timestamp mechanism. So we want to figure out if we could actually affect the contents of this token and how it would be affected. So we registered another account in the application with a really long username, C times 32, which is just, if you don't know, the Perl notation for 32 Cs consecutively. I'll use that syntax a few times in this case study. So when we registered another account with that long username of Cs, you can see what the token is that we got back there. So initially, if you look at that, what jumps out at you? Well, it's longer. It was 7 blocks before, and now it's 11 blocks. That seems to correspond with my longer username. Also, the repetition of some of those blocks, so I see that underlined block in red appears 3 times in a row. So that repetition kind of mirrors that repetition of characters in the username that I chose. So now we know that we can affect the contents of the cookie with our username, and we know sort of what part of the cookie is affected. So now we can kind of refine that a little bit. So we'll register another count with a shorter username, but still repetitions and still C, so C times 16 in this case. And we look at the token that we get back, and we get back 9 blocks this time. So, which is good, because we decreased the username by 16 bytes, and that resulted in a 16-byte shorter token. And you can see that in comparing that to the C times 32 example, you still have that same block appearing in the token. So it's a pretty good guess that that thing that starts in 1941 is the encrypted form of 8 Cs. The question you might ask yourself at this point is, for the first example, for the C times 16, why don't we see 2 of those? And for C times 32, why don't we see 4 of them? why do we see? So the guess here, the theory at this point, is that maybe the boundary where the username starts in the plaintext is not exactly on a block boundary. So maybe maybe the username starts like here, and so that it goes from here to here, and it doesn't correctly perfectly align with the block boundaries. And you can see there must be between 1 and 7 characters at the beginning of the plaintext, causing that username to be offset. So we want to figure out what that offset is. Okay, this is the one that's usually the most confusing, but it will make sense in a couple slides. So we want to figure out what's going on in that first block. What is the offset? So we can figure out exactly which byte the username starts on, and that'll help us later. So what we did is we created a bunch more accounts, which was nice in this particular application. You could just self-registration, create as many accounts as you want. So we created additional user accounts with specific usernames to try and determine what the padding was in that initial block. So we have our all C's example, but then we created one that, for example, started with 1 C and then a bunch of D's, and then 2 C's and a bunch of D's, 3 C's, a bunch of D's. And by doing that, we can take advantage of being able to compare blocks between tokens and understand where the boundary is. So you see that with all C's, our first block is the same as when we start with 6 C's, but when we start with 5 C's, it's a different first block. And the best way to visualize that, what's going on, is like that. So so if you have 5 C's and then a D, that you must be altering that first block in such a way that that's why it comes out as a different value. Whereas if you have 6 C's, that's the same first block as all C's, and so you have the same, you have the identical block there starting in DD. So now we have kind of an idea of where the username lives in this token. So we don't really know what's after it, and we really don't know what's before it, the 2 bytes before it. What we do know is it's an authentication token. So, if I can alter this somehow to reflect a different username than myself, then chances are I'll be able to impersonate another user of the application. So now we want to figure out how do we manipulate this token in such a way that we can do that. So through a different vulnerability in the application, we were able to do a user enumeration vulnerability. So just identify whether or not a certain username exists or get a list of users. I can't even remember which case it was now. But despite that, we know that a user exists named siteadmin, which sounds like a good one to go after. So to impersonate this user, what we have to do is to obtain the valid ciphertext blocks to construct that cookie. So knowing the offset that we just determined, that there's 2 bytes at the beginning before the username and then a bunch of stuff afterwards, that's what we're looking for. The first block is going to be the encrypted form of 2 unknown things plus site AD, and then the next block is going to be MIN, and then whatever else the application decides to put there. We don't really care, again, what that is. So what we'll do is we'll register one user called siteAD00. There was a minimum length requirement of 8 characters for the username, so that's the zeros. And another one called